This learning is Le'ili Nishmas Broya Bas Chananya, Mezeches Terumos Perek Aleph Mishna Hey. Ein termin min aleket umin ashichacha umin apeya. A person is not allowed to separate truma from leket, shichacha, or peya on produce that they have, and the reason is because the leket, shichacha, and peya doesn't belong to that person; it belongs to the poor. Umin a hefker, and also a person can't separate truma from hefker for produce that they have, and the reason over here is because hefker is potter from truma, and like we're going to learn later in the Mishnah, a person can't separate truma from something that is potter from truma for something which is chayev in truma. The Mishnah continues and teaches more examples of when a person can't separate truma from something which is potter for something which is chayev. So what this is referring to is if a person separated ma'aser rishon from their produce before separating truma, and they did it in such a way which is mutter, because they did it before the produce was processed, and now they gave that ma'aser rishon to the Levi. Now, even though this ma'aser rishon is potter from regular truma, still the Levi is allowed to separate truma from it for other produce that he has, because there's trumas ma'aser in it, and that makes it be considered as if it's produce which is chayev in truma. However, once the Levi separates trumas ma'aser from it, now a person can't separate truma from it for other produce that they have. The Mishnah continues, a person is also not allowed to separate truma from ma'aser sheni and hekdesh that they redeemed. So before they redeemed it, they for sure can't separate truma from it, because this Tana holds that ma'aser sheni doesn't belong to the person, so a person can't use it for their truma. And also hekdesh doesn't belong to the person, and so a person can't use that either for their truma. Here it's talking about the ma'aser sheni and hekdesh that were redeemed, and now they belong to the person. And the halacha is that a person can't separate truma from this produce for other produce that they have that needs truma to be separated from it. And the reason is by ma'aser sheni, because ma'aser sheni is not obligated in truma, and so it's something which is potter from truma. And by hekdesh, we're talking about produce that was made chayiv in truma when it was by the gizber, by the hekdesh. And so when the person redeems it, it's no longer chayiv in truma. And so this is something which is potter from truma. And like we said, a person can't separate truma from something which is potter from truma for something which is chayiv in truma. And now the Mishnah gives the actual main din itself. V'loy min chayiv ala potter, v'loy min potter ala chayiv. A person can't separate truma from something which is chayiv in truma for something which is not chayiv in truma, and not from something which is potter from truma on something which is chayiv in truma. And the example that the Bartanura gives for something which is potter from truma is if it's not fully grown, it didn't yet grow a third of its amount, and so that produce is not chayiv in truma. The Mishnah continues and teaches, V'loy min atalosh ala mechuber, v'loy min mechuber ala talosh. A person is not allowed to separate truma from something which is detached for something which is attached, and not from something which is attached on something which is detached. And the reason is because we have a limit that teaches us that both the truma which is being taken and the produce which is being taken from, both have to be detached from the ground. The Mishnah continues, V'loy min achodesh ala yashin, v'loy min yashin ala chodesh. A person is not allowed to separate truma from produce of this year for produce of the previous year, and not from produce of the previous year for the produce of this year. And the reason for this is because we have a limit that teaches us that the truma has to be removed from produce of one year for produce of that same year. The Mishnah continues and teaches, V'lei mi peres ha'aretz al peres chutza la'aretz, v'lei mi peres chutza la'aretz al peres ha'aretz. A person is not allowed to separate truma using peres of Eretz Yisrael for produce of outside of Eretz Yisrael, and a person is not allowed to separate truma from produce from outside of Eretz Yisrael for produce of Eretz Yisrael. And the reason is because only the produce of Eretz Yisrael is chayiv in truma, and not the produce from outside Eretz Yisrael. And the Mishnah concludes, V'im tarmun, if a person did any of these things and separated truma in one of these ways, the halacha is ein trumas on truma. The truma is not a valid truma, and the person has to separate truma again for the produce that needs truma separated for it.